Thank you all for choosing to join our presentation to discuss our scoping review of social and academic integration strategies for retention of nursing students. My name is Kim Mitchell. I am from Red River College in Winnipeg, and I will be your presenter today. Our student retention project was a 3-year adventure for our team, and we used Joanna Briggs Institute scoping review methods, as well as we integrated Tinto's longitudinal model of student departure, which looks at the question of retention as being an issue that is affected by both social and academic integration into the university environment. So we screened over 4,500 papers, and most of those papers discuss schools in the United States in baccalaureate programs. We included 112 papers that met our inclusion criteria, and we also then took a more focused analysis on 48 papers that had done formal evaluations of their strategies, meaning that they actually connected their strategy's success to retention rates within their program. So 35 of those papers were quantitative discussion mixed methods papers that mentioned how retention had changed in their program from a pre-retention strategy period. And then 13 of those papers were qualitative evaluations that asked questions about student integration and sense of belongingness. Our review questions were fourfold. We looked at the kinds of strategies that had been actively implemented within nursing programs, specifically to influence the retention of their students. We looked at what nursing populations were most likely to be targeted in those retention efforts. And we also looked at how programs were evaluating the success of their retention strategies. And by our focus analysis, you can tell that that was not a lot of the programs. 48 out of 112 is what we included as those that had done thorough evaluations and actually connected the findings of their studies to the retention levels in their own programs. Lastly, we wish to provide advice about nursing education policy implications that have emerged from this particular analysis. If you are familiar with the literature on student retention, you will recognize there are numerous stakeholders who face consequences when nursing students are unable to be retained in their programs. The most important of those stakeholders are the students themselves, who face many financial as well as emotional consequences when they are unable to stay on pace with their entrance cohort or do not graduate. There are also costs to institutions for admitting students whose programs are delayed or never completed. Attrition from nursing programs also affects the supply of nurses to the healthcare system. Finally, programs that serve communities with large patient populations from a specific racial group are also concerned with increasing the number of nurses they graduate from that racial group. Students were put into particular retention strategies based on two primary mechanisms. One, they were placed there because of being minority students who identified with a particular minority ethnic group, in particular, say, Indigenous students or African American students. The second route was based on academic need, and that academic need was often assessed via admission test scores when they came into a nursing program. It sometimes would be GPAs at the end of a particular term, and sometimes it would be failures of specific nursing courses that were critical to their program. So at risk, high risk, disadvantaged, non-traditional. These were the very common labels that we saw repeatedly across these papers to define these targeted students. And what do these words mean? They could mean many things. Commuter students, males, ESL, parents, mature students, first in family to university, Generation 1.5 students, which was an American terminology referring to students born in the USA, but to immigrant parents who did not necessarily speak English. Economically disadvantaged, academically disadvantaged, and underrepresented minorities were often the most common groups of students that fell into these at-risk categories. Ultimately, the students themselves and the programs seem to define these students as students who didn't fit in. And you can see fairly clearly that this is a problem of inequity. My image on the slide here says inequality, but really we're talking about inequity. These students somehow are not starting in these programs at the same starting line as other students might have. We grouped the strategies that were described across the papers into various categories that you see represented here on this particular screen. You're welcome to pause the video at this point in order to take a look at what the individual categories are. Mentorship was very popular, study skills workshops and such were very popular. Focusing on literacy, language, and numeracy was a very successful strategy. But there were many others that were also very relevant to helping to retain students. The most successful strategies were multifactorial whole program strategies. So these tended to start with pre-admission recruitment, and then they did some kind of a form of admission testing often with those students, and then were able to place them on pathways. The pathways were usually chosen via scores on reading comprehension components of these admission tests. Sometimes mathematics was used as well. And then the students were placed into a potpourri of retention strategies. So often in the form of, courses that were offered here and there, a course that was maybe offered prior to actually starting the nursing program itself to catch them up on particular basic skills, as well as summer workshops that were offered between terms to sort of keep them connected with the nursing world rather than a big gap in summer. Social activities were also very popular, as well as providing space so that students with similar academic issues could congregate together, or students of similar minority backgrounds also. NCLEX preparation tended to sort of be the conclusion of many of these multifactorial whole program strategies, so students were prepared to write the NCLEX exam. Other characteristics of these strategies is that sometimes they were mandatory, and sometimes they were actually, students were given course credit for taking these, summer courses / introductory courses in their program. The qualitative analysis of these particular papers all focused on asking the students questions about how they are integrating, or how the strategy was helping them integrate into nursing and integrate into their programs. And they tended to both help them academically, but as well as these small group gatherings to help them with their academic skills also help build communities. This made the students feel less alone because they had others to connect with who had similar academic problems that they did, as well as it sort of alerted to them to some of the marginalization issues, some of the racism that they faced when they were with a larger group, when we were talking about ethnic groups that were separated. They sometimes had trouble integrating with the larger group as a result, and they sometimes felt grateful for the ability to have a space of their own in their program. All students reported tremendous academic growth, and they also reported growth in their nursing identity. The findings of our review are suggestive of numerous implications for nursing education policy. Retention is inevitably a highly wicked problem that requires multifactorial and context-specific approaches. Attention to systemic issues is imperative, especially issues of systemic racism. A retention program cannot be successful if systemic issues of inequity are ignored. Stigma control is also required. Students often felt shame and embarrassment about their academic deficits. Language choices such as at risk contributed to stigma, and warnings to avoid these labels began to appear in the more recent literature. Forcing mandatory participation in a strategy also created stigmas, but yet when students that were identified as needing support failed to participate in a strategy, that choice was hugely detrimental to their ability to be successful. Nevertheless, the research papers included in this review demonstrated repeatedly that students with academic deficits could be admitted to nursing programs as long as academic supports and community building were made available to them. Struggling with reading comprehension was a powerful and often invisible barrier to student success, and when students were directed to particular reading supports, that had a significant impact on retention rates. Motivation and self-efficacy efforts through skill building were also important. However, the papers in this review tended to reduce confidence building to congratulations and a hearty pat on the back. Funding students was also a powerful retention strategy, but unfortunately was included less and less in the reported strategies after 2014. And we discovered an ignored population, academically strong students who leave. We found no retention solutions that attended to this specific population who likely suffer from a sense of lack of belonging in the nursing profession. So with that, I will conclude our presentation. This slide contains a QR code that will direct you to a link to the published paper on this topic if you're interested in more information. That link also contains the full reference list for this review and this presentation. And I thank you for joining us.